Welcome to the 3-0 show, part of the Athletic Baseball Show. It's Monday, October 30th. Derek Van Riper here with Eno Saris. Bridgeroli off again this week, but, working, of course, because it's the World Series. And it's been a great World Series so far, especially Game 1, the on-deck crew. Stephen and Levi talked about it a lot earlier in the day on this feed. But as I think about playoff games in my lifetime, this one actually does rank at or near the top of the list in terms of drama and just overall excitement.
Yeah, it was a really exciting game. That was a great introduction to this series. And I think one thing that I was worried about was, my prognostication going in was that like this Rangers lineup would be the differentiator, because we've got, I think, some staffs that kind of have some strengths and flaws that line up pretty well with each other in terms of pitching, in terms of defense. There's a great piece today about from Levi Weaver about how the Rangers have gotten much better at defense year over year. Nate Lowe specifically, but a lot of them. Corey Seager's defense has been better this year, and then D-backs are, I think, consensus one or two best defensive team in the majors. So you've got some pretty good defensive squads, and I thought this lineup, the Rangers, would be such a differentiator. So I was really watching to see how much offense the D-backs would show. And, now in hindsight, like, oh, well, they scored 9 in the second. But like in the first one, I was like, oh, like, is this going to be like a 4-0, type series? But the D-backs offense came through, and, credit to all their hitters. Like, it wasn't just one or two hitters. It's been a deeper lineup than I thought. I thought the bottom third of this lineup would be really terrible. And, it hasn't really been the case so far.
Yeah, I mean, you just think about the way the end of Game 1 played out, right? You get the situation the way you want it. We've talked about some concerns about this Diamondbacks bullpen over the course of the season. I think we've seen in the playoffs they've got a little more depth than people gave them credit for. Some of that's getting some guys healthy and calling up younger guys like Salfranc and just like mixing and matching in different ways. They've done that really well to get to this point. To get to the 9th inning of Game 1 with a 2-run lead, and to have your best reliever, Paul Sewald, out there in a spot where you think you could just close it out. This has gone to script. This is great. We're going to steal Game 1, only to have Corey Seager hit just a moonshot home run. That was a huge, huge moment, because aside from the eventual Adolis Garcia game-winning home run in the 10th, you start to wonder, like, oh, is this going to have any sort of carryover effect into Game 2? Like, you had everything you wanted and it didn't go well. And the answer was a resounding no. I mean, the Diamondbacks pounded out 16 hits in Game 2. They had a hard hit rate above 50% as a team, which is just impressive through and through. And then some of that was piling some runs on late against Martin Perez. But to just come back to the yard the next day and really brush it off, even the series at 1, bringing it back to Arizona, says a lot about this team having a short memory and the ability to just turn around quickly.
Yeah, and a couple key players at the bottom of that lineup. I mean, one that you liked before the season, and I didn't. Give you some flowers for Geraldo Perdomo, and I just didn't see it because if I have a bias, it's towards hitters that hit the ball hard, and Perdomo doesn't really do that.
He does not.
He does not. But he controls the strike zone really well, and he makes contact. And that's something that actually the statistics have proven that contact plays up against better stuff. So as stuff increases, your bat to ball ability and your ability to control the strike zone, it becomes more important. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think maybe you're just battling if it's against like top end stuff, you're just battling. You're just trying to put that bat on ball, and your ability to put that bat on ball, increases. Maybe also high stuff guys can just strike out guys that don't have good bat to ball, and so just putting that lottery ticket out there. But whatever it is, Perdomo has been, I think, pretty huge to this lineup. He's hitting 400, 500, 400 so far in this short series. But also Tommy Pham has put together a lot of good at-bats. He had that 4 single, or was it singles all? But he had 4 hits in game 2, even though he had the Tootblon. If anybody knows what a Tootblon is, it's thrown out on the bases like a nincompoop. Is what that stands for. And he got caught by the inside move at second base, just wandering off the bag. But otherwise, he's been really good at the bottom of the lineup. And they've all made up for the only one that really hasn't hit so far this whole postseason is Christian Walker. And that they've done all this without Christian Walker gives me hope that like this is going to be a tight series and Walker's going to wake up eventually. And it's going to be a little back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think aside from Perdomo doing more than expected throughout the regular season and showing up in the playoffs as your 9-hitter, that's kind of nice. Alec Thomas is another guy that hasn't consistently had the underlying metrics that a lot of us were hoping for, but he's showing some signs in the postseason that maybe there is still a little bit more that we can project on. Obviously, a great defensive center fielder that always paves the way for a lot of playing time. Kind of look at the big picture. Gabby Moreno is excellent. He, as long as he doesn't suffer like another concussion during the postseason, especially, he's an important piece for them. Clearly a leader already on this team, but I think he could come through and provide something as well. And I think the other part of this is like it's an opportunity for Corbin Carroll to sort of ascend to superstar status. That's been the best thing about this Diamondbacks team going on a run. And we talked about it maybe last week is they might be a year or two ahead of schedule, but that's fine. They've got some pieces in place that can absolutely do some damage. Now, the story in game 2 is Merrill Kelly. And the bigger story with Merrill Kelly, the more you think about it, the more impressive it is, right? This is a guy that spent 4 years in the KBO pitching in Korea, a guy that grew up in Arizona, went to Arizona State, and is now pitching for the home club. And it's just like when he came back from Korea, Merrill Kelly, to me, looked like your prototypical number 4, number 5 starter, kind of a low 4s, mid 4s ERA. Maybe the most interesting thing about him at the time was, hey, he's going to chew up a lot of innings. So, your other guys maybe have a little less weight to pull because Merrill Kelly is a good innings-eating back-end starter. And this year, we saw improvement. We saw a strikeout rate that jumped. And given his age, he's 35 years old. That's pretty surprising. He was excellent in game 2. And he's one of those guys that I probably wrote him off 3 years ago as far as making an improvement like this. So I was stunned that he put together the regular season he did. And I think the question a lot of people have is, how is this happening for him at such an advanced age? What has made Merrill Kelly so effective this season and in the postseason compared to what he was doing in his first few seasons after he came back stateside?
One thing that I've heard from a fair amount of players that have gone overseas is that their command has improved when they've gone overseas. And there's a slightly weird reasoning for this, but I've heard it from enough pitchers that have gone over and come back, is that the tight zone, the strike zone is tighter for Americans in Japan and Korea. It's like that, we've actually seen this demonstrated in America too. Like there's bias that runs along ethnic backgrounds. There's different biases in American umpires that have been shown. So I'm not saying that this is something that, shame on the NPB for doing this. It's like something that's sort of inherent in umpiring that we've seen in different leagues. But when you are faced with a tighter zone, you just have to be able to command to a tighter zone. Like you have to improve your command to live in the NPB, which is the Nippon Professional Baseball, is the Japanese league. So when you're over in Korea or you're over in Japan, you're faced with a tighter strike zone for whatever reason, you can improve your command. So that's one thing that I've heard from Kelly and from other guys that have come back. The other is that, he's a guy that lives off of having a wide variety of pitches and commanding them well. So, I think his changeup is actually sneaky good, like a really good changeup, and his curveball is top shelf too. But he has to do enough with all 3 of his fastballs and his 3 secondaries so that he never gets predictable. And I think playing against lineups in Japan and Korea that are something like AAA or quadruple A, getting against sophisticated lineups that are trying to win, as opposed to maybe lineups in the minor leagues here that they're all working on something. They're all trying to just demonstrate that they're ready or whatever it is. Working against lineups that are trying to win, you start to be like, oh, I can do this and I can do this and I can play around with my mix. I can do this when I think this, and so that's what I see when I see Kelly is a guy who can place these pitches at the right time with good command, has a big mix. And for what it's worth, I think I'm making sure of this right now, but a little bit of a velo boost in the postseason. He was sitting 91s and 92s during the season. He's been sitting 93 in the last two starts of the postseason, and that hasn't affected his command in any deleterious way. So large mix, lots of different fastballs. I wrote a piece last week about the new battle for the top of the zone, which talks about how if you have a four-seamer at the top of the zone, batters are getting better. Marcus Semien, other guys have talked about, you just aim 2 or 3 balls above where the ball is supposed to come in. And that's, you get on top of the ball and you use your top hand and that's how you hit the four seamers, right? So if you have a two-seamer and you see that they're hitting your four-seamer, then what you do is you throw a high two-seamer. And this year in baseball, we saw 3,000 more high two-seamers and sinkers than we'd seen before. And so, you could think of that like, oh, it's a high fastball. It's a high hard pitch. That's a fastball. I'm going to aim for the top of it, get my top hand on top of it. Oh, it's dipping. It's a high dipping pitch. And so I had a video of Tommy Pham missing over the top of a high sinker because he thought it was a four-seamer. And there's more of that. So what you've got with Kelly is a guy with 3 fastballs. So if the hitter sees hard, they'll think maybe hard this way. They'll think, hard four-seamer, hard sinker. Well, they only, Kelly could make it so they only have a third chance of being right. Because he could, you thought it was a four-seamer, it was a cutter. Oh, you thought it was a cutter, it was a sinker, So he can, with 3 fastballs, he can really play. Hitters just want to be able to say, I'm going to pigeonhole you. If it's hard, it's this. If it's soft, it's this. And he can really play with all those definitions.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You mentioned how good the changeup is when you pair a great changeup with 3 different fastballs, and you also have 2 breaking balls that can show up on occasion. Whether or not those pitches are even good is more just you have to think about them. You have to account for them. It's something you can sneak in certain situations at the very least. I think that's what makes me wonder if is this version of Merrill Kelly. When you look at someone like Lance Lynn, when you say a lot of fastballs, I'm like, oh, Lance Lynn, he's got 1 million fastballs. He doesn't have the other stuff that Merrill Kelly has, right?
Kelly has better secondaries than Lance Lynn. But I was like, I definitely thought of Lance Lynn recently. I was thinking of Kelly. I was like, Kelly's like a Lance Lynn with better secondary.
Right. If you're Lance Lynn or you're the pitching coaches that work with Lance Lynn in the future, you're probably pointing to Merrill Kelly and saying, look, he's not lighting up the radar gun. He's got some things that you do. You could take some of these approaches and maybe make a version for yourself. I thought there were some really interesting things about game planning behind the scenes. I saw Andy McCullough had a story about Dan Herron, who his title is a pitching strategist for the Diamondbacks. We know Brent Strom, longtime Astros pitching coach, is the actual pitching coach for the Diamondbacks. There's, of course, a little bit in there about those two working together. Very different philosophies, but making it work, which I think is really interesting. So definitely read Andy's story about that. But you start to think about the level of planning that actually goes into each and every matchup within a game and the difficulties that I think are presented by an extended series in the postseason, like only compounds that. It makes these matchups even more intense because you have to have extra wrinkles or something that the hitter hasn't necessarily seen before. What are we going to
keep in the pocket for game 6 or 7,
Yeah.
Are we just going to show everything?
you got to be good enough to get there to put that, if you even get to the second, third, fourth iteration of your game plan. But I thought there were a couple interesting things. There was a great thread from Trevor May on Twitter breaking down how he would pitch to Adolis Garcia with his stuff, which is not saying, here's Brandon Pfaadt and here's how Brandon Pfaadt's going to try and do it in game 3. But I thought that was really insightful, just looking at all the different places that Garcia is good, places where he's got some weaknesses and some holes, and how you take your pitch mix and your location strategy and sort of marry all of those things together. And then you start thinking about the other side, right? Trevor's perspective is just the pitching perspective. The hitter has to sort of anticipate all the things a pitcher might do and then react to that or plan for that. And it's just this amazing cat and mouse game that I think is so much more detailed now more than ever. It's always been there, but the amount of information everybody has at their fingertips makes this even more complex than it's ever been.
Yeah, some of my favorite conversations in the clubhouse I've ever had was when Dan Herron was pitching, and Zach Greinke was on his team with him, and we would get into three-way conversations. In fact, one of my favorite conversations with Trevor May and Max Scherzer last year about Stuff Plus, or maybe this year. So, there's a little bit of a corollary there, but one of the things that makes it so difficult is what you're talking about, the hitter anticipating his own scouting report. And so there's this concept in the military called the red team. And the red team is basically trying to scout yourself, is trying to beat yourself. So if you have cybersecurity, the red team is trying to hack into your own stuff. And so you can tell how people might hack into your stuff. And so, or the red team, if you have a base, the red team attacks your base so that you can see how people would do it and what you would do in response. And so I think most teams now have a red team when they're talking about scouting. And so if you're the hitters on a team, the red team comes up to you and goes, this is how we think they're going to attack you. Because we have all access to all these true media things. We know where your cold zones are. So Adolis, this is what they're going to do to you. And you saw that Garcia actually reacted to this. I got some texts about this that were interesting. What was it? Adolis' swing rate in the playoffs before last night was 59%. He swung at 10 of 30 in game one. That's a red team thing.
It's a big difference in approach.
That's like, hey, level. Dude, they're gonna try and pick you apart high in the zone. So if it's high today, don't swing at it at all.
Yeah. So on that thread that I mentioned from Trevor May, Lance Brusdowski, we bring up quite a bit on Rates and Barrels for some of the great stuff that he puts out there, basically asked, when is that actually a real adjustment? When do you as a pitcher have to change based on a hitter showing something different like that? And this is where there's the desire to have statistically meaningful things that you can lean on. And then there's situations like this where there are not statistically meaningful things that are going to pop up. You have to decide.
Some of the stuff he's making decisions off of are very few pitches too. If you look at the Trevor May thread, you're like, are you making these decisions based on 5 pitches? I've some of these heat maps, you can actually see the pitches. There's 3 pitches on them.
You can see the seams on the ball.
I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, don't pitch him there because the one time you pitched him there, so he hit a homer. It's like, so that's part of it for sure.
Yeah, just an incredible amount of detail. So check out that thread.
But I also there's also the secondary level of okay, so I've determined that high fastballs to Adolis Garcia. That's the blue zone on there. He obviously doesn't like it. I'm going to come in there with some high fastballs because that's blue there. And red team goes over to Garcia and says, hey, maybe they don't have to because Garcia has seen this all year.
He's swung through them. He's like, they're coming.
The high fastballs again, So they tell him either you can anticipate that, maybe you can do the top hand adjustment and smack one of those out of the park, or just take those. Just today, just take those. Maybe that's what he did in game one is take those high fastballs. If you have a really good hitter and you're looking at small blue zones, one of these low and away for Garcia even was just it wasn't all low and away. It was just the corner was if you have these really good hitters that can make adjustments and they know what you're going to do because they've had their red team come in, or they just see it. They know what you're going to do. Sometimes it makes sense to do something suboptimal. Mookie Betts, for example, has a weird blue zone middle. You know, I don't know why. It shows in some of his heat maps. Maybe you throw him a middle fastball, you know, in a 2-0 count. You'll just be like, I'll never get that.
Don't. No, you still don't. That's too far down the suboptimal rabbit hole. Yeah. Like there are levels of suboptimal that are clever because they're unexpected, and there are levels of suboptimal that are stupid because it's just too bad of an idea.
Where's that line? Where is the line?
Middle is on the wrong side of that line. Okay. Where exactly the rest of the zones fall, I'm not certain, but yeah, you're not going middle.
High sinkers and high sliders are right there on that line, because if you think about it, like throw a high sinker and you miss a little bit, and that's just a ball that dips right into the middle of the zone. Throw a high slider and not really get it high enough, and that's a hanger. So yeah, and sometimes, you know, also you like do the scouting report and you're like, ooh, like I was looking at Brandon Pfaadt and he's moved on the rubber and he's starting to throw a sinker, and the move on the rubber, you know, I don't want to get too complicated into it, but it changed the angle of his pitch coming in, the horizontal angle of his pitch. And if you study horizontal angle, you can see that, you know, it creates swings in certain places and takes in other places. So I was looking at this and I was like, oh, this opens up the front door sweeper for Brandon Pfaadt, because the way he's standing now, you know, he's going to get more takes on the inside. So what he should do is throw a sweeper at the right-hander's hip and let the movement take it into the zone, and he'll get a bunch of takes. And I was thinking about that in my head, and I was like, he does not throw that pitch very often right now. So as a coach, I come up to Brandon Pfaadt, a rookie who had a 5.7 ERA this year, is on a good stretch in the postseason. I say, okay, today against Adolis Garcia, I want you to throw a sweeper that's going to hit him, and instead the movement's going to take it into the zone, and you'll get a called strike. It'll be beautiful. It'll be so good. And Brandon Pfaadt's going to look at me and be like, "You want me to aim at Adolis Garcia?"
He's a large human on top of all of this,
who just had like a whole, even in Trevor Bay's thread, he's like, oh yeah, up and in. That's where Brian Abreu was probably aiming. Mm-hmm. So there's like, you're also, that's what I liked about that piece with Heron too. It's like, these are humans, you know, and you have to have some empathy and like some understanding of who they are as people and emotionally. And you can't just be like, well, the numbers spit out that you got to throw some front door sweepers today, dude. It's like, okay, well, I've thrown like 5 of them all year. So thanks for that scouting report. I'll try a couple today, I guess, in the World Series.
Great time to experiment with things, right? So the series, of course, is shifting to Arizona for the next 3 games. It could end in 5. It's possible. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going at least 6. I'm going to stick with my original prediction.
Game 5 as a fan.
Yeah, you get to go to game 5. Our buddy Chris Welsh is going to game 3 , so we're going to have a lot of
game 4.
Your so Mama might be a guest on the pod next week. That's awesome. The matchup in game 3, Max Scherzer versus Brandon Pfaadt. Like Levi and Steven talked about it on deck this morning, and the depth of Scherzer's outing in game 3, I think, is really important because you don't have an off day until Thursday. Mm-hmm. And if Scherzer goes really short in this game, some of your preferred long options in what is more of a bullpen game, I realize the health of John Gray and that he's back kind of changes some things a little bit. It could hurt you in a pretty big way in game 4, just based on your kind of starting rotation construction as it is right now. So we've talked about Scherzer a couple of times already in this postseason. What's your game plan if you're the Diamondbacks looking at Scherzer and the struggles he's had? Like, how do you make life difficult for him on top of the possibility that he could make life difficult for himself?
He has not had his breaking balls since he came back from injury. And this is something that shows up in, you know, I've got a stat stuff plus that looks at the shapes and the velos of it. But also, if you just watch, he can't locate them. And he's had a really, really hard time locating his slider in the zone. And that's what makes Max Scherzer so great is he has good fastballs and he has good breaking balls, and you don't know what count you're going to get either in. But if he can't throw a 2-0 slider in the zone, and he's always had like 4 breaking balls and great touch on 4 breaking balls. If he doesn't have that, then he's going to have to go to the fastball in fastball counts. And he's going to have to go to the fastball when he needs a strike. And he becomes much more predictable. So I think I would just sit fastball. I would take a very conventional approach. We just talked about like how crazy we can get in the head. I think this one would be like, I'm seeing dead red until he proves to me that he can throw a slider in the zone when he needs a strike, because he has not shown that ability since he came back from injury.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense based on how things have played out for him so far in this postseason. You talked about Pfaadt with the adjustment to the other side of the rubber, and this goes back to about August. He's pitched a lot better since then, right? The regular season numbers, the ERA was close to 6, but if you kind of slice it from August 10th forward, when he started making those changes, he's been a pretty different pitcher during that time. What do you think the Rangers are trying to do to make Pfaadt uncomfortable? Because this is a lineup that it's just like the problems Pfaadt had to solve against Philly, and maybe even a little more challenging in some ways at the very bottom, where some of those bottom hitters for the Rangers are a tick above the bottom hitters he was facing in the NLCS against the Phillies.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that he's continued to do, so in August, he went down to the minor leagues. And I just wanted to say, like, really quickly, you've got a bunch of players here who've benefited from a reset on these teams. Where you're talking about Alec Thomas, he was a better player when he came back from the minor leagues. Brandon Pfaadt went down to the minor leagues, came back up with a new release point, and then over time started actually throwing the sinker more. So there's the release point that happened after he came back, in July, but then he started throwing the sinker a lot more in September. And if you look at his splits, Pfaadt, after he started doing both, throwing from that new position, and then also, throwing the sinker, his strikeout rate was pretty decent. And he's been a great pitcher in the postseason with those things. So, I think that there's just, there's some scouting reports that people have that are old. And then you just don't have, because you don't want to, you're like, oh, well, I don't want to be looking at this heat map where it has 3 pitches on it. But if you look at Brandon Pfaadt before the move on the rubber, that's not useful. And then if you don't look at him when he's been using the sinker as much as he's used, that's not useful. So you really only have like September and October to look at. And if you're trying to be like, oh, well, I'm a right-hander, then you're cutting that in half. So you're really only looking at like 300, 400 pitches from him. And then you're cutting it into pitch types, and you're cutting it to zones. Like, people are looking at things where they're like, they're looking at these heat maps. So there's 3 or 4 pitches, where they need to look. And I think, I don't know what to do in this case. I think every team should have a young guy that's like pretty good, that has made a recent adjustment that nobody's seen, ready for the playoffs. I don't even know how good Brandon Pfaadt's going to be next year, but right now he's doing stuff that nobody has really that great advanced intel on. The sample size is not great. And so what would I tell a hitter is maybe see ball, hit ball. People have been aggressive against him and people have been passive against him, and neither one has really worked. He's been really good at sort of tweaking small things and getting the most out of whatever approach the hitters are doing against him. The Phillies tried both. They were aggressive and patient against him, and neither one really worked that well.
Do you think there's any situation outside of a massive lead where Pfaadt gets more than the 18, 19, 20 batters? So we've seen the pretty quick hook. I mean, the only reason I'm even thinking it's possible they'd push him a little is if he is holding a 2 or 3 run lead or something. Yeah, first in 3 days could force things to be different. But similar to the problems you have at the top of the Phillies lineup, the matchup with Bryce Harper in the NLCS is kind of like what he's got with Corey Seager in this series, where It's like Brandon Pfaadt versus Corey Seager. If he finds a way to not get destroyed by him the first 2 times, you really don't want to tempt fate and give Corey Seager a third look at him, right?
I mean, you just yeah. Like, did you if you watch the Phillies series, like Pfaadt against the lefties was not comfortable.
Yeah,
like every at bat between Pfaadt and Schwarber was like 9 pitches.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all just like, ooh, just trying to dance around the nitro zone, trying to throw weird pitches, throwing sweepers, to lefties. You shouldn't do that, but like, you just got to keep Schwarber guessing, and at one time he even got Schwarber, I think, on a high 4-seam fastball, which is like that was the pitch that Schwarber like couldn't hit for a long time, but then figured out how to hit. Like he got Schwarber, he was throwing low sinkers to Schwarber, which is like, you just had to like do crazy stuff because he had to figure out a way to get those guys out. And Schwarber and Harper, the lefties, were the hard ones for him, even with a good changeup that Pfaadt has. It's hard. You don't want to throw a sinker to them. Your 4-seam's not that great. You don't want to throw a sweeper to them. You're just kind of like, I can't just throw only changeups to these guys. I got to throw something else. So, yeah, the Seager thing, I think the third time Seager's up is when Pfaadt is out. And I know that people will roll their eyes and be like, oh, analytics taking over the game. And, this is a problem. And, if Pfaadt is dealing, he should be left in. And, I get all that. And in fact, there are some analytical arguments that, teams can get into trouble taking their stars out early. 1, relievers are worse every pitch they throw over the course of the season. That's been shown. 2, relievers are worse on back-to-back days and back-to-back-to-back days. That's been shown. Their velo is down. Their command is down. 3, and this is just out in the Sabre journal. This is newest research, is over the course of a series, the more times you see a reliever, the better you get at them. And that effect is bigger than the third time through the order penalty. It's like a really big thing. So, every time you run Ryan Thompson out there, the first time is going to be good. The second time, if it's in a back-to-back, it's going to be worse. And if it's third time, it's a back-to-back-to-back, and the same hitters have seen him 3 days in a row, somebody's going to get to him. So if there is some sort of lead, I would passionately argue for leaving Brandon Pfaadt in and not giving the opponents more looks at my relievers, that I only have a few that I trust anyway.
Yeah. And I think the threshold for me is a 3-run lead. If you're up 3 and you get to that point where he's starting to see the lineup a third time, there's no one on base,
just walk Seager.
Let it go. Yeah, like, let's see what happens. As soon as there's trouble, then play the matchups, go to your bullpen. But he may be able to navigate some of the bumps the third time through if everything is working, if the strategy is good enough to work against these hitters. I think the key difference for me, though, too, when you think about NLCS versus World Series and these matchups, and instead of being Schwarber and Harper, it's Evan Carter as the other guy with Corey Seager as the lefties up top, right? And I think Evan Carter is a fantastic player. He doesn't have the experience that Schwarber does, and I don't feel, even though Carter can do damage, I don't feel like a mistake to Evan Carter is quite as likely to end up 450 feet away, even though, again, Evan Carter is a very good young player. So it could be a slightly easier combination of matchups, but I would also say the righties are going to be a problem too. I'm also interested to see Marcus Semien. Is he going to get going in this series? It seems like it's inevitable because Marcus Semien's been such a great player since the Rangers signed him. There was that brief lull first like 6 weeks into year 1 where he was struggling, and he's been fantastic in the time since then. Can he get right here mid-series?
Yeah, what's his postseason line? It's been a whole problem in the postseason. 194, 265, 226 in the postseason, and that's in 68 plate appearances. That would be a bad month. Do you remember what was the year that it was last year when he signed the contract, and he was like one of the worst regulars for the first month of the season. And we had a long conversation about that once, and I don't want to give, I'm not like in the business of excuses necessarily, but I think as an explanation, changing teams, not being able to work out in a team facility, and, moving his whole family and his kids to a new situation, and He explained that like he was, trying to be awake to send the kids to school at like 6 or 7 in the morning, after, playing till midnight 1 or whatever, like after being awake the night before, and trying to, put naps in there, but it sounded exhausting just listening to it. And I think that was a big explanation. And as a guy who's played so many plate appearances, he's just one of these post to post everyday guys. I wonder if there is any fatigue in him right now. The bat speed doesn't necessarily look all the way there. He's making contact, but there's no power behind it. And he also made like a couple of mistakes in the field that I was like kind of just really surprised. It just looked like sort of concentration errors. I wonder if he's tired. I mean, I just, it's to see, probably everyone's tired, but I wonder if somehow, all those plate appearances for him have added up to a little bit more fatigue than some of the other guys out there.
You go back through the last 3 regular seasons, there's no player in Major League Baseball with more plate appearances than Marcus Semien. 2,201 in the regular season, tack on the postseason this year on top of that. He just doesn't take days off. Totally a fair question to wonder if fatigue is starting to set in here for him as we near the very end of October. Quickly looking ahead just to game 4, in theory, it's going to be some combination of probably Heaney, Dunning, Gray. We'll see what they decide to do based on what happens in game 3 versus what I assume to be an Arizona bullpen that did the job in game 4 of the NLCS when they used 8 pitchers. Right? That was the game that Joe Manaply started. We saw Luis Frias, Kyle Nelson, Miguel Castro, and
who were the guys that did 2 innings? Thompson?
I think it was Thompson. Sal Frank can usually give them more than 1 if they need it.
Yeah, but he's got the command is so minus.
I just wonder, like, how much can you follow that same script, right? You want to follow that script again, but
it seemed fairly lucky at the time that it all worked out.
Yeah, you kind of just flirted with disaster and got away with it in a pretty difficult spot. I don't know if that can work twice against top level lineups.
Yeah, I think maybe they'll have to use some Ryan Nelson for some length, which is living on the edge given the results. But one thing that Ryan Nelson does have is a fastball with an interesting profile. So if you're not asking him to turn the lineup over, in which case he can't keep throwing that same fastball, but if you just ask him to turn the lineup over once, which is 2 innings, 2 or 3 innings, then I think he could do that. So I'm guessing we're going to see Nelson in there just because they need more length. And you just if the score turns, they might go to Ryan Nelson for 4 or 5 because they got to protect that bullpen because there's the next game.
Right. If you have any issues with Gallen, or if you want to make sure you have everybody that you like available for game 5, it's part of what makes the playoff baseball so challenging, just making sure you've got the right guys available for the right spots. And you don't always know what's behind door number 2 or what's going to happen in the next inning, but that's just the difficulty of managing the game. Looking back, it was Frias for 1 1/3, Castro for 1 2/3, Thompson for 2. Those were the only 3 pitchers that got more than 3 outs for the Diamondbacks in that bullpen game in the last round. So something similar seems very likely for them in game 4. And you kind of return to your game 1 matchup, Gallen versus Montgomery for game 5. So a lot there to like, or Gallen versus Evaldi, right? That's the game 1 matchup. So nice to see that one coming back around in game 5. It's a great pitching matchup for you since you're going to be on hand for that one.
Oh yeah, that'll be fun. I'll be in the stands with Paul Spohr, who I've done podcasts with in the past from over at Fangraphs. So that'll be fun. And then into that weekend, the Arizona Fall League All-Star Game, which is always a crazy transition to go from like the World Series with, they're selling standing room only tickets, and tickets are pretty expensive, and it's like, I think it's going to be pretty wild. Like Tuesday night when my mom's going is going to be Halloween, so that's going to be pretty wild. And then the Arizona Fall League is like, there might be 50 people in the stands for a game.
Yeah, for the regular game,
30 of them are
show up
scouts.
for Fall Stars at least. Like Sunday night is the Fall Stars game. For anyone who's not familiar, they televise it on MLB Network. So if you're not going to be in Arizona, you can at least watch it. A lot of prospects that appear in that game end up playing in the big leagues the following season. So you and I will be there as part of a fantasy baseball conference. So beyond the Athletic Baseball Show, we've got a Rates and Barrels that'll come out on Tuesday. So if you're already thinking about next season, we have you covered there, and we're going to have an episode that we record while we're in Arizona as well. As for this show, we are signing off for today, but the Athletic Baseball Show returns on Tuesday.
Always got the green light here.